Flourishing is a dialogue, not a monologue. We all want the good, but sometimes my good conflicts with your good. And so can we have a dialogue process that will enable us to better appreciate the good as other people understand it and find ways to honor that and find ways to build a global community that can resolve conflicts and get to the deep roots without trampling on the goods that are being articulated. That's really inspiring work to get involved with, because you realize that your starting point has been enriched. What you thought was flourishing now is starting to open up a little bit because you have received some precious wisdom from these others who have infinite value.
Hello and welcome to the Conspiracy of Goodness podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Linda Ulrich, and I'm also the founder of the mothership website of this podcast called The Goodness Exchange. Our purpose is to put a spring in your step again. Basically, we're shining a light on what's right with the world. Today, we're going to introduce you to an amazing thought leader in the world, Matthew Lee. Matthew is the visionary director of the Flourishing Network at the Human Flourishing Program at Harvard. Matthew's pioneering work has not only garnered widespread acclaim, but has also tangibly transformed lives around the world. Through innovative programs and insightful research, he has illuminated a path to kind of holistic human thriving. Instead of this, I just got to survive another day outlook that comes upon us a good bit of the time. Matthew's work is inspiring individuals to embrace meaning and accept with resiliency the ups and downs in life. I heard him speak at a webinar for this amazing group that I belong to called the Awaken Group. It's associated with an organization called Service Space, which is just too much for me to talk about here, but we're partnering with their Daily Good newsletter that publishes all kinds of good news all across the world, and we're partnering with them. But anyway, I heard Matthew speak for an hour and a half, and I couldn't keep up, writing down the quotes and the wisdom and the hopeful things. So I just had to have Matthew on this program, and he got back to me graciously after I emailed him, and now I can't believe it. Got goosebumps. We're here talking to Matthew Lee about a life of flourishing, which we all want to embrace. Welcome, Matthew Lee.
Thank you so much, Linda, for those kind words, and really delighted to be with you today.
Well, we've got to start out on a subject that I just find a little fascinating. No, a lot fascinating, because I don't think the world operates this way. And it's one of these, this is perfectly representative of the kind of thoughts that Matthew tends to lay on us. It's a few words with a big meaning. So you like to say, every person is infinitely valuable. There's so much beauty and grace in there, but I don't think that's what we see out there. It's certainly not what we see in our news feeds, this notion that every person is infinitely valuable. Let's start there.
Yeah, I think if we are interested in flourishing ourselves, it's helpful to appreciate our own infinite value. And I think sometimes people have difficulty with that. And if we want to help others flourish, it's helpful in terms of our motivation, because it can become challenging to do this. It's helpful to understand that they also have infinite value. And so just even if you don't believe it, just live as if, and it's a practical step. Like, I don't believe I have infinite value, but I'm going to treat myself as though I do. I don't believe you have infinite value, but I'm going to live as if that were true. That will get you a long way in the world. It's that sort of fake it till you make it. But if you really do believe it, I think you go even further. You understand, the great commandment, the scriptural commandment to love your neighbor as yourself embodies this, because it's not love your neighbor to the point that you're destroying yourself, because, both you and the neighbor have infinite value. And so if we can appreciate that, then a lot of possibilities open up for us. And people come to that through a sacred tradition, whatever their background might be, or through interspirituality, putting things together. They come to it through just an immediate realization, an instant kind of epiphany that they have. They come to it through the generosity of others, people loving them more fully into being, oh, I must have some value if people are investing in this way. And they come to it through suffering and hardship. You have that fourth stage cancer diagnosis, and you finally stop to reflect. I've been busy. What's it all about, and who am I, and what was I created for? And you start having these kinds of conversations, and you can come to it through that pathway. So I think there's a lot of ways that people have this realization, but there's a lot that gets in the way. And so part of our journey is, I would say, from moving from monologue to dialogue. And when you start to listen deeply to another, you start to understand something about yourself. You start to care more about them because you can see something that wasn't readily apparent about their struggles, about their vulnerability, about their triumphs, and about where they're stuck. And you say to yourself, well, I've been stuck and I've had some triumphs that I can now acknowledge. So it's really a kind of humility, not in the sense of humiliation, but just a right understanding of who we are in this universe, and the realization that we can either fake it until we make it, or we can start living wholeheartedly into it. And what happens when we do that, we discover we actually do feel like we have infinite value, and other people have infinite value. And this beautiful created world has infinite value, and all things in it have infinite value. Then we start to value even the things that cause suffering, because we see how it fits into a broader story. So I'll stop with that, but that's what arises for me today.
That is so beautiful. I love this living as if. It's like a fresh take on fake it till you make it.
Yeah.
But I think it's more expansive than fake it till you make it. I think, just if you acknowledge that you're faking something, there's something that's a little bit of a disconnect right there from you getting any feedback from the universe or the world or another individual that's real as well, right? But if you truly living as if, there is so much potential there. Thank you for dropping that one on us right off.
Mm.
Okay, so that leads me to want to ask you about something else. Okay, so how do you define flourishing? Because I think most people define flourishing in the way that we have all the trappings of success around us. We have every toy we ever wanted. We have the trophy husband or wife or whatever it is. Everyone has their own definition of success, but you're not talking about that. You're talking about something very different when you use the word flourishing.
Yeah, I think that I always like to point this out, that the best things in life are transcendent and can't be imprisoned with language. So when we talk about flourishing, we know we're using a word that's pointing to something that we can't fully name. So I just offer that in all humility, that we're trying to describe something with our cultural frames and the language we have. So the best things are transcendent, can't be named. Second best are mythical. You tell stories about them, and then you kind of get close to them that way. And then the third best are empirical, and that's where I live. I'm, a social scientist, so I'm working with things that are third best. But we do sort of intuitively know when we're seeing something that the word flourishing seems to cover. So if we think of flourishing as complete well-being, how is it complete? Well, happiness and life satisfaction and well-being and wellness, all of these things can be extracted from the world at others' expense. So we can feel happy because we have the yacht and we're floating in the Mediterranean, sipping our, margarita and laughing while the world burns. But that's not flourishing. So what flourishing, I think, has come to represent, and it's an evolving dialogue, a critical dialogue, often contesting how it's been used and then trying to point to something more holistic. It's really this sense of wholeness amidst adversity, and not just what's good for me, but what is good for all without exception. What's good for the planet, what's good for the life-sustaining systems that support us all, and what is deeply meaningful and resonant with a larger sacred story. So that it's not a useful definition. I understand it's sort of like, a lot to grapple with. But when we talk about complete well-being, it's something that is relational rather than extractive or transactional. So my flourishing contributes to your flourishing, and then we flourish together. Our flourishing contributes to our world, and we all flourish together. Our flourishing world contributes to the unfolding of a sacred narrative, and then we all flourish together. So it's this sort of like, the Fetzer Institute likes to talk about a fourfold community of being, where you have sort of the self, you have the world, you have the sacred, you have the society, you have all of these interconnections. It's interbeing, really. And so you can have a high level of happiness and a high level of well-being and be doing terrible things according to a sacred narrative, or do terrible things to the planet or terrible things to your neighbors. So flourishing, I think, is inviting us to think about how it all fits together. And that's why I like the construct. I was using it before I had joined the Human Flourishing Program at Harvard, and others have been using it to try to signify something that is really about mutuality and dialogue rather than monologue and extraction. So, I like to say, just to kind of sum up, flourishing is an outcome, but it's also a journey. And so sometimes we don't feel like we're flourishing. We're, losing sleep, changing diapers for an infant at 3 a.m. and getting sick, physically ill. Well, we're not flourishing. But actually in that moment, if we think about it, we are nurturing through love the fullness of being for another. And that in itself is very virtuous and flourishing. So if we think about flourishing involving an integration of individual, communal, planetary, and spiritual dimensions of life-affirming forms of well-being and ways that promote well-doing, then I think we have a richer conversation than the reality is that groups and individuals have been pursuing selfish forms of happiness at the expense of others. And so actually a lot of the conflicts, the deep-rooted conflicts in the world, trace back to an in-group seeking its own happiness at the expense of others or at the expense of planet. So flourishing is inviting us to start making connections between the various domains of well-being that we might want to pursue, happiness and physical health and, satisfying relationships and the like, meaning and purpose, etc. And how our pursuit of those domains of well-being are either generative for others or extractive for others. And so I think it's a lot to keep in mind, but if we don't keep it in mind, and this is why we need a community to keep it in mind, because we can't hold it all ourselves. But if we don't do that, then we're going to unwittingly create conflicts and harms in our world, or perhaps intentionally create harms and conflicts in the world. And we've had enough of that. We can't continue on that path.
One of the things that I've been noticing lately that just is like fingernails on the blackboard for me that I think relates to that. So I'm going to have you comment on it. There's kind of a sense of righteousness sometimes. Like people will advocate for things that they think are good for society. And there's like a background of righteousness there that is just like fingers on the blackboard for me. But it goes back to what you're saying. It's got to be everybody taken into consideration. Am I right about that? Like you're not really flourishing if you're just advocating for something that you think is the right way for everyone to live.
Yeah, flourishing is a dialogue, not a monologue. And so this is why I was saying that it requires a community to hold it, because flourishing, according to Matt Lee, will only get you so far. It'll only get me so far. And so I need the feedback of others. And that's why, we have this beautiful survey, the Global Flourishing Survey, that we're following up to over 200,000 people in 22 countries after having gone through a process of dialogue to create the items and translate and back translate and all of that. So that's beautiful. But we also have a different kind of inquiry, which is really fundamentally dialogue. And so the survey can tell us something, and we'll bring that into dialogue with the other mode of inquiry, which is to create communities of practice around the world where people in their own language, with their own sort of cultural background, can speak into the broader conversation about what is flourishing in a more collectivist setting rather than an individualist setting, and so forth. And so what we want to try to understand is, what are the universals? Where do we see people around the world saying, this is important? And then what are the culturally specific ways that are meaningful for some groups, but maybe not all groups? And value those for the groups that find them meaningful, but we don't need to impose those on others. And so I think what's going to come out of it, if I had to guess, is that the contest will be over defining the good. Because, we all want the good, but sometimes my good conflicts with your good. And so can we have a dialogue process that will enable us to better appreciate the good as other people understand it, and find ways to honor that, and find ways to build a global community that can resolve conflicts and get to the deep roots without trampling on the goods that are being articulated. So it's a very big challenge, but I think that we have to move from monologue to dialogue. We've had thousands of years of mostly monologue, and it doesn't get us very far. And so we're starting to listen, and we're starting to appreciate, and there are going to be some universals, and there are going to be some important particularities. And that's really inspiring work to get involved with, because you realize that your starting point has been enriched. What you thought was flourishing now is starting to open up a little bit, because you have received some precious wisdom from these others who have infinite value.
Mm-hmm. Oh, there we go. We just made a giant circle. Good job. Lovely. Well, I want to point out to folks that, you are not just thinking ethereally. You're not like an ethereal thinker. You're a researcher. Like you called it you're on the third level there a minute ago, right? Yeah. But I mean, you're just looking at this in many ways, just like a scientist, just cold, hard facts, folks.
Well, I like to engage with the topic through research. And so there's facts there, and sort of objectively in a sense. But I also like to reflect on this more intuitively. And so, I think that poetry and novels and great works of art and music, all of these other modes of inquiry are just as valid, including the spiritual mode of inquiry. So there's always a kind of subjectivity to this kind of work, which I think is necessary and a beautiful thing if it's held in dialogue rather than forced through monologue. So I think that as I reflect on my life, it has not been driven by the scientific results.
Yeah.
It's driven through meaningful experiences that are somewhat intuitive or spiritual in nature. And then we try to document that as best we can through our scientific work. But, the first best cannot be named at all. So, that's really what's drawing us, what's inviting us into the deeper dialogue. And then, how do we make that work in a scientific setting is a second question.
So I don't know if this is scientific or it's just a perspective, but talk to us about this. You've got this great, beautiful way to measure whether we're flourishing. What I love, I love this. I have to ask myself this. I'll give you an example. Before I knew of your work, a couple of years ago, my mom was passing of all kinds of things at the same time. And we moved her to a new assisted living place. She passed away 5 days later. But in those first 2 days at that place, we watched the show Frasier for 17 hours together and laughed our heads off. And it was like she had dementia. But for some reason, for that 17 hours, I felt like I was flourishing. I had to ignore my dental practice, ignore my family, ignore everything else in the world, and just spend the last few days with my mother. And I wasn't fully appreciating that it was the last few days at that moment, but I think I probably inside knew it. Anyway, I remember sitting on the couch about halfway through that Frasier marathon and thinking, this is as good as it gets. This is, and I think I felt that sense of helping somebody else, and that made me feel the flourishing that you're talking about. When you think of the big picture, I was helping my brother and sister because they were working people that couldn't be there for that chapter and blah, blah, blah. Is there a way to measure whether we're flourishing?
Well, it's such a beautiful story. It's almost like I have this intuition that we shouldn't try to analyze it. Like that's complete and beautiful in itself. So that's the kind of the story which gets closer to the transcendence. Then we try to measure it, and that's again third best. But I think that one thing we can do is to ask you a series of survey questions. Did you find meaning and purpose in that experience? You're really, I think, narrating what Martin Buber famously called an I and thou relationship. And that's where the other is not an object to be manipulated, not I and it, but I and thou. And so when you are relating and encountering, he says this is not an experience. You don't reduce it to experience. It's a sacred encounter. So you encounter the sacredness of the other, even the person who's at the end of life with Alzheimer's and not able to communicate in the conventional ways. But there's this deep kind of encounter with the sacredness of the moment, the sacredness of the other, the sacredness of the self, and the sacredness of the whole world. Then that is that kind of wholeness, wholeness amidst adversity that we were talking about a minute ago. So how do you measure that? Well, you can ask survey questions, and I think the survey questions tell us something. I think we get something from that. But what I have noticed, and we can talk about where this comes from in a little bit, but what I've noticed is that when people are really flourishing, even in a terrible situation, there's a kind of quality of shining eyes that that you can see, and you can feel it. And so we have to measure that qualitatively, not quantitatively, but it's this kind of emergent property when a group begins to find, from the point of what our friend Jim Ritchie Dunham calls a vibrant space of trust, when they start to find a deeper shared purpose emerging from that space of trust, you see this kind of shining eyes phenomenon. And so we're just starting to figure out, how do we qualitatively measure that so that we can tell a compelling story? Maybe we need video or something, or photographs or something, not just what people say, through discourse, but what they're living and how are they living that? And even in moments of terrible grief, or maybe especially in moments of terrible grief, there can be a kind of freedom where the shining eyes that have been hidden through the routines of the busyness and routines of life starts to break through.
Let's take a little detour here and talk about that expression, shining eyes, because you have an amazing story that I think we've all lived through about how you came by that notion of shining eyes. Tell the story of you and your wife in Ben Zander's video.
Yeah. So some years ago, we were living in Ohio, and the conductor of the Boston Philharmonic was visiting, guest conducting a concert. And my wife, Joanna, was in the choral society that was doing Beethoven's Ninth. I forget what the other piece was. It was some obscure piece that they probably wouldn't let him do in Boston until he tried it out somewhere like Akron. So he comes in and he meets with the orchestra and the choral society. And she came home later that day. I was teaching a course, a university course called Love in Action at the University of Akron. And she comes home and she says, this guy, Ben Zander, he's like really embodying everything you're talking about in your course. You really need to pay attention to him. Check out his TED Talk. And I had just been like saturated with TED Talks. And I just said, okay, I'll take that under advisement. I'm sure he's a great guy, whatever. And she said, he talked with us for an hour and invited dialogue. It was, beautiful dialogue. And it wasn't about music and it wasn't about the piece. It was just about life and what brings us meaning and joy and et cetera. So I just sort of filed that away, and I'd seen a lot of TED Talks and I was sort of over it. And I didn't pay attention to it. So we moved from Akron to Harvard, and I'm there for 4 years. And then I'm about to take this position at Baylor University. And we're just traveling around central Massachusetts, one of our final weeks in Massachusetts before we're leaving. And we came upon this bookstore in the middle of nowhere. And you walk in, and right over the door, it says, "Books you don't need at a place you can't find." I thought that was brilliant. And so, Joanna and my younger son, Nathan, were exploring one room. It's this big old barn, and there's an attic. And my son is named Xander, and I are up in the attic. And bear in mind, this is like 4 or 5 years later from when Joanna said, "You got to watch this TED Talk." And so
by Ben Zander. Just want to mention his name one more time.
Yeah, Ben Zander's TED Talk. It was on classical music. I forget what.
I've got it written right down here. I'm just going to tell people right now that they can find the link to it in the article on the Goodness Exchange.
So we're in the attic, and I noticed a book by Zander and Zander. And I turn to my son and I say, "Xander, check this out. How often do you see that?" So I'm curious then to pick it up and see, who the authors are. And it's Benjamin Zander and his wife. And the book is called The Art of Possibility. And I open to a random page, and it's like this, this epiphany. Well, page 99, Tess, which we'll talk about in a moment. But, I sort of just started opening to some random pages, and I thought, where's this been for the last 5 years? And I think, oh yes, Joanna tried to get me to take a look at this book. And so I go back home and I watch the TED Talk, and at the end of it, he talks about how he measures success. And it's not the number of tickets sold for a concert or the number of compact discs sold from the recording, but the shining eyes on the stage among the musicians and the shining eyes in the audience. And that means some genuine connection has happened. Some heartfelt connection has happened. And I thought, yes, this is what we should be measuring. And maybe we can quantify it. But like when you told your story, that was sufficient documentation for me. The story itself, qualitatively expressing something, doesn't need to be reduced. Like I give that a 10, or I give that a 5 out of 10 or something. As Kierkegaard says, love is beyond bookkeeping arrangements. There's a kind of infinity that we're starting to, we move out of finite time and into this experience of infinity in this moment that is really difficult to quantify, or he would say impossible to quantify. But I just thought, I'm going to start paying attention to shining eyes in my classroom, in my family, in my community, in my research. And so the next project that we're embarking on is going to be how to come up with a way to convey that we have found shining eyes in a way that the scientific community can receive it. And it's going to be a challenge. But I think that some video, I think that some images, I think there's a way for us to show how a group which started out in conflict and maybe rage in the eyes or just kind of numbness or deadness can, through a series of practices, come together and the shining eye phenomenon can emerge. So this is an example of grace, because I was resistant for who knows what reason that day. And then I didn't follow up. And then, I would say the Holy Spirit kept nagging me until finally it's like, look, dummy, here's a book.
Zander and Zander.
And I put you with your son Xander so that you would pay attention to it. So, that's how life has been as a reformed criminologist now studying flourishing. It's been a series of those kinds of nudges that eventually I start to pay attention to, because I'm slow and I need to be reminded. And so the reminders can sometimes be pleasant, like spending some time in a bookstore with your son, or they can be unpleasant. But eventually there's this like voice saying, pay attention. And you accept that as grace, so, sometimes fierce grace.
Mm. Yeah. Okay. So we're going to take a break, and we come back. We're going to talk about all kinds of interesting concepts like your upset becoming your setup, and flourishing with grace. Like, what is that? And flourishing at work, that is such a huge topic for many of us. There's a great sort of source of stress going on in our working lives. So much to share with Matthew Lee. Let's take a break. You know how the constant negative noise in our digital lives feels like it's reaching a boiling point? Now, many of us have tuned out the news and social media almost entirely. Well, it doesn't have to be that way. There are newsworthy stories about amazing progress, innovation, leaps in human potential, and wonders in the natural world, and they're just not reaching the top of our feeds. We can have access to this, but none of us has the time or maybe even the emotional stamina to search through all the doom and gloom news to find what's right with the world. Okay, enter the Goodness Exchange. There, we are giving instant access to positive news for curious people. Did you hear about the recent Harvard study that found that exposure to just 4 minutes of good news can make you 32% less anxious and 18% more optimistic? Well, I don't know about you, but I need those kind of numbers in my life. So, if you want to live with more joy and way less fear, it's really simple. First, you join us at the Goodness Exchange. Everyone around the world has the opportunity to access this kind of content. And we've promised no politics for about a decade, so you're safe from all that distraction as well. Second, you allow this new, more positive, balanced worldview to put a spring in your step again. It can change the way you react to your kids, your coworkers, everybody you come in contact with. And the stories we write about can make you the idea person in your circles. These challenging times call for us to wake up and take control of our perspective. The people who use the Goodness Exchange have the ability to react to the harshness of the world much different because they know way more about what's right with the world. And that's a resource. So subscribe to the Goodness Exchange, our YouTube channel and the podcast, and use this content to live a more expansive worldview. It is still an amazing world out there, and you can be a part of it. Welcome to the Conspiracy of Goodness. Okay, we're back. And of course, during the break, Matthew and I just started another sideways conversation. I was telling him how fortunate I was to have stumbled upon his work that way through the Awaken group and Service Space. And you've got kind of the same feeling about Service Space.
Yeah, this is another example of grace. So I have a dear friend from Akron who was telling me when I was there, it's now probably 7 years ago, your Love in Action class, this group Service Space is putting that into practice thoroughly, 100%. You've got to check them out. Okay, I'll add that to Ben Zander's TED Talk. I'll get to that when I have some spare time, and I never did. And so years later, this was I think last year, I saw that I was going to an event, and the founder of Service Space, Nipun Mehta, would be there. And I told my friend Joanne from Akron that, hey, I might run into this guy. You've been nudging me. And it's, again, the universe keeps inviting us, and we sometimes don't pay attention, but eventually you can't not pay attention. So I'm in Stockholm, and my flight was delayed. And so this dinner started without me, and I've got my suitcases, and I've got to go up 3 flights of stairs. And this beautiful human being of infinite value comes over to me and says, "Can I carry your bags?" And I thought, I don't know who the founder of Service Space is, but I'm thinking it's this guy. And it was. And so his flight was delayed as well. So we ended up sitting together at this dinner. And then we later had another follow-up conversation. And that led to me being on the podcast, the Awaken Call. And, it's just another example of me not taking the wisdom of a friend or my spouse, Joanna, not taking their wisdom and following up, and the universe saying, okay, you won't pay attention initially, but we will find a way. And I have experienced the process of preparing for that interview, just as you were sharing with me before we jumped on this one, all the homework that you did and the care that you put into understanding my work and who I am, so that this conversation could skip the small talk and get right to what really matters. And the folks at Service Base did this so beautifully as well. And they reflected back to me in a bio sketch that they wrote, clarity about myself that I didn't even see. And so it's kind of like, a person becomes a person through other persons, quite literally, that Ubuntu idea. Like, I'm starting to see who I am because people like them and people like you are reflecting something back that I wasn't fully in touch with. I was sort of in the flow and not, as self-aware. And so I think that the great gift, and then a beautiful thing on that call, they invite my friend Joanne to reflect about me in a video that they recorded, which was just totally unexpected. And I, it's still a great treasure in my life, that whole experience with them. And now having this kind of I and thou dialogue with you, where something's emerging that's not something I prepared, or it's not something I've thought through fully, but it's being loved into being. I go back through my life and I think these different people who have offered something unexpected and undeserved that have lifted my horizon beyond what I thought was possible or what I thought I could contribute to. And even, even at the Human Flourishing Program, Tyler Vanderweel, the director of that program, I thought I was doing some reasonably competent social science until I started to appreciate, through what he was offering, a different way of sort of grounding the work in the rich wisdom of the humanities, and then using methods that can actually move us beyond association and two causalities. Pioneered that. So, who am I to be connected with all of these people? I just sort of marvel that somehow this life has taken this journey, and who I have become is, I think, 1% related to Matt Lee and 99% related to grace, including the grace bestowed on me by these other people. So, and for whatever reason, I can be as slow and ignorant as I want to be, and life just keeps waking me up.
Yes. I love that. And that is, we call it, we have several words for that in our family. We have them. Happy accidents
Yes.
is a good one. Accidents is a good one, when we don't choose the right thing, but it turns out to be okay in the end. I think that there's a lot to say about being graceful, being full of grace. Mm-hmm. In the way we handle the harshness of the world as well. I kind of went on a journey of trying to coax more grace out of myself, because I'm a fiery person. I know I don't come off that way in this grand 10-year adventure to point to all the goodness in the world, but I can be kind of fiery. And one day during the pandemic, there was a guy sitting on the street corner in our little town of St. Albans, Vermont, with a giant big poster that said, "The COVID pandemic is a fake." He was a youngish kid, 20, 21, 22, something like that, just sitting on a lawn chair. And I always keep a lawn chair in my car for moments like this. I found that if I just pull up a chair with somebody, I'll admit, I'll let contempt trigger me, but I change the contempt to curiosity. So I my dental practice was closed down. My kids we went from a household of 2 to 8. My kids all came home and brought somebody to live with us for 2 years. I mean, to me, COVID was real. So I had this moment of contempt when I see this guy with the poster, and I pull out my lawn chair and I go sit next to him. And, I just decided to be curious. And my gosh, what a story that kid had. It was mind-boggling, and how generous he was about sharing it with me. And, at some points he kind of caught himself and he goes, why are you here? What, do you have a recording? Are you recording this? Like at some points he was like, why is this happening to me? But man, I tell you, it was a moment I'll never forget. And then I always have made sure that lawn chair is in that car from then on, because I think if we can change contempt to curiosity, there's a level of grace there that we can bring, and we can find what you're talking about the necessity of others to help bring out what we're fully capable of being.
Your upset became your setup. It's a beautiful story. Yes. I mean, I would be thinking about my friend and colleague, former colleague from the University of Akron, who passed away from COVID. So, I know that it's real. And yet, how do I relate in an I and thou way when I'm tempted to, to not go to curiosity, but to stay in contempt? And so there is a practice of just sort of taking 3 deep breaths to shift the nervous system a little bit from that natural instinct of fight or flight. And in my case, I probably would have just gone into flight and left that scene. But how do you move from fight or flight to tend and befriend? And a few deep breaths can give you that space where you can remember, oh yes, this person has infinite value.
And what if we reminded ourselves in that moment that we feel the upset?
Yeah.
That this upset could be my setup. I just love that expression. You have a great story about that. Didn't a child say that to you? Or where'd that expression come from?
A friend told me that, but I was sort of reflecting on my movement from just reproducing what I'd been socialized to do as an instructor in a class, sage on the stage kind of approach, and, tests and memorization and, textbook and all of this kind of stuff. And it didn't seem like education to me. And so I started shifting away from that and trying out little experiments. And then eventually a group of us at the University of Akron started offering what we called unclasses, which are sort of the opposite of everything that we were doing before. And so instead of handing out a syllabus with the reading list and the dates of the exams and everything on the first day, you spend the first few weeks with the students co-creating the syllabus. And instead of meeting in a classroom, you meet somewhere in the community with a group from the community to tackle some issue that the community wants support with. It's an invitation to share power so that it becomes power with instead of power over. So I think the unclasses were spaces of shining eyes, including my own, because I saw students coming in year after year with more anxiety and more stress and even depression. And the shining eye sense was just being extinguished. And so this was a way to rekindle that. And it was harmful for me too, to be part of something that was producing disengagement. So if you look at Gallup data, the most engaged students are in kindergarten. About 8 out of 10 are really invested and absorbed in what they're doing. And we're sitting on the carpet holding hands, singing and finger painting the alphabet. So the core content is enriched by the creative arts and by friendship and by caring. And then over time, we extract all of that. And so by middle school, only 6 out of 10 students are engaged. By high school, it's 4 out of 10. So it works for some small percentage, less than a majority. It works okay. But many students are becoming disengaged. And so we could say that the primary deliverable of our education system is disengagement. And then what happens after high school graduation? The even lower level of engagement among teachers, 30%, 3 out of 10. And then you look at other workplaces and you see something similar or even lower still. And you say, well, why would we want to collectively create a world of disengagement where the shining eyes are extinguished and people are not flourishing? And then how can we be creative in solving the serious global problems if we are ourselves disengaged. And if our workplaces are places of disengagement. So that's the upset that became the setup. And I've seen, workplaces where there is full engagement, and I've seen the shining eyes, and work can become a platform for flourishing, or it can become a platform for extraction and disengagement. But where people are participating in these I and thou encounters, again, I mentioned Jim Ritchie Dunham earlier. He has a phrase for this. It's ecosystems of sacred hospitality. And you see this in businesses. You can see this in government agencies. You can see this in universities. You can see it in churches and mosques and synagogues, but you don't always see it even in the religious community. You can go into we did a book some years ago called The Heart of Religion, and we toured a number of different churches, and you could see the shining eyes more prevalent in some and not so much in others. And so an ecosystem of sacred hospitality can be created anywhere. And sometimes you don't find it where you think you're going to find it.
Isn't that's so true. We expect, I just did an interview, it will have published by now, with a guy named Doug Barnard, who is a YouTuber, over 500,000 fans. His fans are super active. He leads trips to Iraq. That's what he does for a living. He absolutely loves the Iraqi people and the ancient wisdom and history there that's just you can literally walk among it. Eventually it'll be like Egypt where everything's protected, but right now. And that's what he says. That you've said it in the kind of words that he isn't grabbing onto quite yet, but he says that they have a sense of sacred hospitality in Iraq where they just embrace, and the minute they find out he's an American, they're even more hospitable. Mm-hmm. And we Americans, we would think it would be the other way around, don't you think?
Well, I think that ontologically, we are created to participate in sacred hospitality. So it's just at the core of our being, and we unlearn. Very young kids are often naturals at this, and then they're taught, oh, that's an unsafe group, or that's a group that has been harmful, or whatever. So you start to share that with your in-group. But there's a natural just openness among many young children that they can become our teachers as well. And so if we expect that somehow I'm generous and I'm giving, and some other group of people are ungenerous and not giving, then we're denying the ontological reality, which is that everybody around the world is generous and giving. And if our social structures don't get in the way and our socialization doesn't get in the way, we can unlock that together. We can experience that ecosystem of sacred hospitality. So that's another direction that the research is taking, which comes out of, again, this sort of intuitive sense that emerged in various people's personal experience, and then became part of a dialogue that's now becoming a topic of inquiry for scientific methods. So that's the natural progression. But I do think that there's a great opportunity for us to say, oh, these rigid social structures have been here forever, and you can't do anything about it. For us to say, well, what happens if we do something different? What happens if we leave the classroom? And will we go to jail? I mean, none of us went to jail. And what if we don't hand out a syllabus on the first day? And what if we don't stand on the stage and lecture? And what if we don't have multiple choice exams? Nobody went to jail. I mean, sometimes you go to jail, but we didn't. So the rigid structures are not as rigid as they seem, and we can just find others. This is the conspiracy of goodness, right? We can just find others to conspire and dream and try and see what happens. Take some steps, and maybe if we went to jail, maybe that would be a source of learning too.
Exactly. Well, and that is a theme that runs through all of your work, is this consistent opportunity for learning, whether it's good or bad, it's you're a better person for it kind of thing, which we all know to be fairly consistently true through all of our varied lives. Mm-hmm. I just want to tell people that episode with Doug Barnard, where he talks about taking people all over Iraq and how beautiful that country is and the people too. That is going to be episode 182. If people want to go to the Conspiracy of Goodness, will have published by then. Okay, now we've brushed against it several times, but in our conversation about the setup and grace and all that stuff, we're stuck with our work environments.
Yeah.
And and the complexities of everybody's dynamics in our work environments. Talk to us about flourishing at work and what the heck that will mean. And I love this concept of sometimes you have to just acknowledge that it's not quite the right vessel for you. Like, give us your thoughts on flourishing at work.
Well, I'll start. I actually decided to select a quote to kick us off. And, when I think about the work that I've done in different workplaces, I think this quote really rings true. This is from Brian Wellinghoff, who's the senior director of outreach for a company called Barry Waymiller Incorporated. And they have factories and consulting businesses. They have like 140 subsidiaries around the world. They do a variety of things, manufacturing and others. And he says, and this is a direct quote, "What we have learned over several decades is that when love is present in the workplace, it creates the most nurturing environment for flourishing." So what I like about this is that it's love that's doing the creating, and we're just participating in that. Like we can wake up and pull the book off the shelf that says Xander and Xander and participate in it, or we can walk on by. And so, and I experienced this in one of the factories where the people were so warm, and we could go anywhere and talk to anybody. And I was talking to one of the machinists, and he said, under the old regime, before Barry Waymiller took over, it was a very toxic place. And you knew with the business cycle going up and down, people would be hired, people would be fired. And you just knew that. And that has changed. We don't get fired even during COVID, even during the 2008 financial collapse. So we don't get fired, so we're safe. But he said, you wouldn't share your knowledge with anyone else, because when it came time to fire people, you would demonstrate that you should continue to have a job because you knew something that they didn't. Well, of course, that's a very inefficient way to run a business, because if you're out sick and nobody knows how to fix the machine, then the whole thing grinds to a halt. So it's really a disaster for the organization to create a space where people are genuinely unsafe and they won't share. And so what he said is that now I really enjoy mentoring others. And we used to have bosses, and now we don't have bosses. We have self-leading teams. And so it's nice not to have a boss, and it's nice to share the burdens of leadership, because he says, sometimes, it's nice to pass that on and have it rotate instead of having that be the burden of one person. Then there's an us versus them. So now it's a we. And I enjoy sharing the information that I've learned over the decades that I've been here, and it makes us all stronger and more successful as an organization. So, that's a case where it's not a wellness program outside of the workplace. It's finding flourishing in what we do as part of our job. And they use the word care primarily to describe the secret ingredient. Brian calls it love in that quote, but care sometimes is less of a loaded term. I prefer love. But you don't just tell people you have to care about each other because you have infinite value. How do you begin to see the infinite value? It's through sharing, listening, gratitude practices. So there are concrete rituals, practices that are enacted daily that can help people to get in touch with the reality that these other people have infinite value and I have infinite value. And we know we have value because they're not going to fire us when the next downturn comes. We are, in fact, physically safe because it's just good business. It makes no sense to go through this process of routinely building mistrust.
And, something that I came across when I was doing a little homework about your work is that there's this idea that it's about receiving love.
Mm.
But you found that it's not about receiving love. It's about seeing your love make a difference in others. That is like fundamentally so huge in what, if you stomped your foot and said, hey, we're supposed to be using love around this office, it could be because you're expecting to be receiving it. But really, it's if you're wholeheartedly a part of a group that's using love as a fundamental principle, wouldn't it be that you can see your love make a difference? Talk to us a little bit about that.
Yeah, that's wonderful. And we did some research looking over time at young people and how they maintain sobriety after having issues with substance use disorders and various forms of crime and delinquency, including violent delinquent acts. How do they turn away from that? How do they maintain a more flourishing relationship with others and with themselves? And many of them went through a kind of 12-step process. And the 12th step is really about giving back. And one of the PI, the principal investigator on that project, had already written a paper showing that for adults, if you do the 12th step instead of stopping at the first 11, where you are giving back to others, you are seeing your love make a difference, then your sobriety is 40% greater than if you stopped at 11 steps. So the sharing and caring and loving is really important to and the founders of Alcoholics Anonymous, who came up with the 12 steps, really appreciated that they were earning their daily reprieve from their own inner turmoil by reaching out to help others. And so we ended up documenting this with these young people over time, that if they would practice what we called twin virtue, which is love and service, that their outcomes were much, much better over time. And so love and service, one of the founders of Alcoholics Anonymous, Dr. Bob, gave his final public address in Cleveland, Ohio. And he had cancer and he was very weak and he could barely say much of anything. And he said, it boils down to love and service. Let's not make it overcomplicated. If you can connect with love and service, that really puts you on a different path. And so in some sense, if I'm really depressed or feeling angry I've had periods of life where I wasn't always flourishing. I realize that it's all self-focused. It's my suffering. It's my problems. And so if I'm in that kind of space of just turning ever inward, then I'm not seeing my love make a difference. And that's the thing that's harming me. And so, yes, I need to be loved. I need people to support me, but I don't just want to be a charity case. I want to be someone who is contributing to a flourishing world. And if I'm participating in that, then I've earned, my daily reprieve as well. And so it really is the case that we have perhaps overemphasized meeting needs of young people who are dealing with substance use disorders and various forms of delinquency. And we have not recognized that one of the biggest needs is their need to be of service to others. And I think it's really helpful to draw a distinction between servanthood and servitude. And servanthood, and this comes from a book called Christian Caregiving, which is the kind of one of the foundational texts of something called Stephen Ministries, which are used in many different denominations, lay persons who are caring for others in their church who are suffering. And so the idea of servanthood is that this is an expression of something you are called to do and you participate fully in it. Whereas servitude, this is where you are forced to do something you don't want to do, and it's very extractive. So a lot of people experience the workplace as servitude, as extraction, and it makes them less engaged. And you can go into two factories making the same products with the same processes, and one will embody servanthood, as I saw in Barry Waymiller, and one will embody servitude. And so what's different about that is whether love is present and whether people have been empowered to love others more fully into being and see their love make a difference. And so I think this is why the CEO of Barry Waymiller, Bob Chapman, says your immediate supervisor is more important to your health and well-being than your primary care physician. And he's absolutely right about that. So if we have a process of unlocking our ability to engage in servanthood as an expression of love in the workplace, then we're going to see all sorts of benefits from that, including financial growth for the company. And if we fail to appreciate that, then we can expect all sorts of bad outcomes. And I like to say, when you see an organization that has failed financially, I like to imagine that probably moral bankruptcy preceded financial bankruptcy.
Yes. Yeah. That's, I look back at my 35 years of being involved in patients' lives, and, in a small town, stuff is happening way before it happens. And I think that I'm sure there's a connection there, because what I've noticed in trying to run a business, we've had as many as 12 to 17 employees in the dental practice that my husband and I are dentists at for 35 years. When we started encouraging our team to pick their own, like we got voted off the island. We don't hire our own staff. They hire their coworkers.
Right.
And when we stepped aside and did that 15 years ago, the love and caring and helping each other and all that quotient it multiplies every single time they get a chance to choose someone new, because they're fulfilling, they're looking at exactly what you're saying. They're saying, I want a new member who's gonna be additive to this group and the love that we're putting out there for each other and our patients.
That's beautifully said. And, Bob Chapman says, leaders are everywhere, find them. So, but are we creating processes where we're even searching or inviting these leaders to show up? And so that, workplace can be a heaven or a hell, depending on what we are inviting. And so I think it goes back to these ecosystems of sacred hospitality. When you have a sense that people are merely functions and they're just cogs in a machine, then you'll have all sorts of disengagement and bad outcomes. People will be worse off because of the time they've spent with you. But when you have a sense that they are sacred subjects with as much infinite worth as you have, then you invite leaders to emerge. And then leadership is a capacity of a system. It's not something vested in the president or CEO. It's really a capacity of the system where everyone can begin to see their love make a difference. And it shows up through innovation and all sorts of kind of cognitive advances. But more importantly, it shows up at the level of shining eyes and at the level of the soul. And that's where you see people who genuinely care about each other. They are part of a community rather than just punching a clock for a few hours and then they scatter. They actually, we like, in the Flourishing Network, we've adopted this motto, which we got from UC Santa Cruz, one of the colleges there: the pursuit of truth in the company of friends.
Well,
and so
that's just what I was going to ask you about.
Yeah.
That. Yeah. Exactly. That's what our work environments can be. You're going through stuff together with people, and
Sure.
You're all learning new truths about what's important and what's not, and all that. That's a great dialogue too. Well, we are going to have to. Okay, so I'm just scrolling through my questions. There's some really important things there. There's your longevity calculator comments about stress and how we flourish. We can flourish ourselves to death. And you've got the page 99 rule, which we have to turn people onto. There is so much here that we didn't get to talk to. Will you come back and talk to us another day?
Absolutely. It's been a great joy, and I am flourishing more because of this I-thou dialogue that we have had. So thank you so much.
Okay, well, I tell you, I know that you've got another meeting coming up. Why don't we wrap up today, and we will have a part 2 to this interview. I only got through half my questions, so it'll be as rich and full of all kinds of new concepts for everybody as well. Well, why don't you help us wrap up this episode with a thought about what you really wish people knew? One of my things is trying to help people get through the daily noise, the negative noise on the news. No matter how much you plan to tune it out or you've taken yourself off social media, there's still this background. It's like the negative noise in the background of our lives. If this interview had just been 3 minutes long, what do you really wish people knew related to that topic? How do we get through the negative noise?
Yeah, what immediately comes to mind is something that Fred Rogers, Mr. Rogers, children's television show host, said in the wake of the 9/11 attacks. People said, this is terrible, and it's calling into question the goodness of humanity. What should we tell the children? And he said very simply, keep your eye on the helpers. And, that's what we need to do. There are many more helpers than there are aggressors doing these terrible things. So it really is inspiring to see all of the helpers. And there is this noise, and a few people can wreak a lot of harm and havoc on others, but there's many more helpers. That's probably the best advice I've received.
That is so, so true. Thank you, Matthew Lee, for joining us for this a little bit longer. We're not going to cut much out of this interview, and we're going to have a part 2. So stay tuned, folks. I hope that all the wisdom and hope and joy and new ways of thinking about things that we shared today will help you through your week. And you join us next week for another interview with an extraordinary thought leader who's just not rising to the top of our feeds. But I have a feeling that Matthew Lee will be a household name one day. Because you are helping us transition from this noisy chapter of life to what's possible next. So thank you, Matthew.
And thank you for the shining eyes today.
Okay. Well, mine are just beaming at you. All right. Have a great day, everyone.